begin? First of all, I'd like to thank the library for having me here this evening. But just as important, all of you who were brave enough to show up to talk about Paranormal Wisconsin from the safety of wherever you're watching this program. My name is Chad Lewis. I'll be your presenter this evening. And although my background is actually in the field of psychology, for the last 25 years, I've been traveling the world in search of the strange and unusual. Everything from hunting for vampires in Transylvania, looking for the Loch Ness monster, crop circles, UFOs, reports of abductions, really weird people, odd places, you name it. If it's just strange and a little offbeat, I've traveled around the globe in search of these oddities. But what I discovered on my travels is that sometimes the weirdest things happen right in your own backyard. So that's what we're going to explore this evening. Some of Wisconsin's strangest cases. For the next 45 minutes or so, we will take a tour of the entire state, looking at some of the weirdest supernatural cases Wisconsin has to offer. I'm going to give you the background, the folklore, the eyewitness accounts. I'll talk a bit about some of the research we do at these locations. Heck, I'll even provide you with the directions to these places. But I'm going to leave it up to each and every one of you, whether you're a diehard skeptic or a true believer or somewhere in between, to travel to these places on your own and determine whether or not you believe them for yourself. I know a lot of you have probably seen TV shows on hauntings, UFOs, and monsters, but it's a much different matter when you go to these places on your own. Because when you're out in the middle of nowhere and you see that shadowy creature lurking from tree to tree, you simply can't turn to another channel and forget all about it. So with that in mind, let's explore some of the most bizarre cases Wisconsin has to offer. First stop, UFOs, unidentified flying objects. Now, it should come as no surprise that we get reports of UFOs here in Wisconsin, because not only do we have the UFO capital of the world here in Wisconsin, we have 3 of them. Bellevue, Dundee, and Elmwood all claim to be the UFO capital of the world. All 3 have UFO Day festivals you can go to every year and explore the unique history. And this is just the tip of the iceberg for how many UFO sightings we have in Wisconsin. In fact, one of the weirdest UFO cases you might ever hear about happened in the small tourist town of Eagle River, Wisconsin, back in 1961. It happened to this gentleman, Joe Simonton, a plumber and part-time farmer. Simonton was having a late breakfast, early lunch one day when he looked out his window and he noticed what appeared to be this craft descending into his yard. Simonton said it was about 30 feet wide, 12 feet high, and had all these little muffler type rings around it. I have to give Simonton credit because he hadn't given much thought to UFOs prior to this, so he wasn't really scared by this. Instead, he was more interested. So instead of just watching from his window, he walked out and encountered this craft. It was hovering a little bit off the ground in his yard. As he did, an opening appeared on the craft. Simonton said it opened like the trunk of a car. And out to the front came one of the men, the pilots, the alien, the inhabitants, whatever it was, it came to the front. Simonton saw a couple others on board. They were all identical looking, very short, dark hair, dark eyes, dark skin. Simonton said they reminded him of very small Italian men. They were all identical. Simonton was greeted by the leader. Now, the leader was carrying some type of jug. Simonton realized they must want water for the jug. So without any verbal communication, Simonton goes and fills up the jug with water from his house. When he comes back, he hands it to the presumed leader, and he looks inside and sees one of the other things in there seems to be cooking something over a flameless type apparatus. Simonton, trying to get some sort of communication flowing, pointed to the man cooking and motioned like an eating. Like, is he cooking something to eat? The leader recognizes Simonton's interest, heads over and trades him for the water, giving Simonton what newspapers were calling the saucer alien pancakes. Traded Simonton several of these for the water. I told you this was going to be a weird story. Simonton ate one of the pancakes, said it was the worst tasting pancake he had ever had. He said, no wonder these people are so small. If this is what they're eating, I feel terrible for them. Simonton had no idea, but while he was trading water for pancakes, several people were calling in about UFO sightings over Simonton's area. I spoke with a gentleman who was a teenager at the time. He told me him and his buddies and his mother were out in their backyard of the farm hanging out, when all of a sudden they saw a craft fly over their farm heading towards Simonton's. For his part, Simonton watched as the craft simply shut the hatch, flew up into the sky, and disappeared. Once the story broke, Simonton was overrun with people calling him about his experience. In the first week after his sighting, over 1,000 people showed up to his farm looking for those alien pancakes. Simonton, until the day he died, believed that he had encountered something not of this earth. But his story got so much negative publicity that Simonton, like so many others whose stories go public, wished he never would have spoken about it. In fact, he claimed that he had other sightings, but he simply did not talk about it because of what happened after this sighting. The pancakes themselves were analyzed. Some say they came back as nothing more than buckwheat pancakes you can make at home. Others said they had ingredients not of this world. But it's one thing to trade pancakes with these creatures. It's another when they seemingly take you against your will. That's exactly what happened to a family in Bloomer. For decades, they had been experiencing oddities. Normally, they just chalked it up to nightmares or hallucinations. That is until one night when the mother was sleeping in her bed. This is not her. She was sleeping in her bedroom, which this is her bed, and she awoke in the middle of the night with the urge to go to the bathroom. Nothing out of the ordinary there, so she walks back to her bathroom, which sits right at the bottom of your screen, just off where the picture is. But you can see she has some glass windows overlooking her backyard. So as she's walking back to go to the bathroom, on the heavily forested area in her backyard, she noticed some strange balls of light hovering. As she stopped to take a better look, she noticed several things. They weren't just balls of light. They seemed to be attached to some sort of craft, and they were flashing. Based on the distance, she didn't know exactly how big of a thing this might be. She thought maybe the size of a house. The second thing she noticed was that the lights weren't stationary. They were moving toward her house. Now, here's the odd part. It's the middle of the night. She's standing, having to go to the bathroom, looking at a UFO in her backyard. And her first thought was, did I lock the front door? Kind of an odd thing to think, but you'll see why she thought it in a moment. She goes darting to the front door. When she got there, she told me out the front window, she could see what appeared to be weird lights similar to these floating in her front yard. She immediately thought to herself, I'm too late. They're already here. And at that moment, her door began to open on its own, and a heavy fog rolled in. She braced herself against the door, but it kept opening. She said it wasn't as though somebody was kicking it in like an intruder might, but just a consistent pressure opening the door. In her mind, she heard someone telling her, stop acting like a child. You know you can't stop us anyway. The last memory she had of the door was seeing through the fog a hand come in from the outside, reaching around to grab at her. She claimed that the hand wasn't human. It looked more like some alien hand. The next thing she knew, she was back looking at the UFO in the backyard. This time, though, the UFO was heading back toward the woods where it originated from. The next morning, she awoke in bed. Again, this is not her. And thought it was nothing more than a bad dream, like she had done so many times before. That is, until she went out with her husband and kids to play in the backyard, and right where the UFO was hovering, she noticed this strange burn mark that wasn't there the previous day. She also agreed to undergo hypnosis. Under hypnosis, she recalled being taken from her house that night by three creatures she described looking like this. She didn't know what to call them, but those of us in ufology know these as the Greys. The large, oval-eyed, almond-eyed creatures that are reported in a high majority of abduction scenarios. She was brought on board and underwent several medical procedures. She didn't know what, but they were doing something. What terrified me the most listening to her under hypnosis recount this was the fact that she said every time she's been taken on board, she could recognize upwards of a dozen other human beings. She didn't recognize them as friends or family, but she recognized that they were humans on board at the same time she was. Even up to this day, this woman has reported activity taking place, but she seems to have made peace with it and thinks that it's for some larger purpose than herself. And she's not alone. Every year, we still receive hundreds of reports from people all over the state who have seen something in the sky they simply can't explain. But UFOs are by no means the weirdest thing roaming Wisconsin. Perhaps the most infamous cryptid monster out there is that of the Bigfoot, known throughout the world as the Bigfoot, the Yeti, the Yowie, the Sasquatch, the abominable snowman. When most people think of these creatures, they often think of the heavily forested western portion of the United States. They don't often think of the Midwest. Yet every year I receive dozens of reports from people who have seen what they believe to be a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch. One of my favorite cases happened right outside of Neillsville in the year 2000. That's when this part-time farmer and newspaper delivery man, James Hughes, was finishing up his route of dropping off papers. It was just getting light out as he was heading home. He wasn't that far. He was on a road he knew all too well. As he was driving, he slowed down because way up in front of him, he saw something big on the side of the road. He thought maybe it was a bear, and he didn't want to kill it or roadkill or crush his vehicle, so he slowed down. But as he got to the area, he realized it wasn't a bear at all. By this time, the thing was moving right across the road. He said it was about 8 feet tall, furry hair all over it, and it seemed to be carrying something in its arm, some freshly killed prey or a roadkill. He thought maybe it was a deer or a goat, but James Hughes told me that he couldn't get a good look at it because as he almost came to a stop, he was so terrified by the creature's eyes that looked right at him that he almost swerved his car off into a ditch. He finally made it home, told his wife about the encounter, but did not report it. He didn't want to report it. He knew how it sounded. But the very next day, he did report it just out of caution that it might hurt someone. A law enforcement officer showed up. Together, they went back to the area of the sighting, looking for any tracks, any droppings, any fur left behind, which they found none. It wasn't long after his sighting that I interviewed Mr. Hughes at his home. I also noticed that right down the road from him was a farmer raising livestock. So I went and questioned the farmer to see if he was missing any of his livestock. Maybe that's what the creature was carrying. But if the creature was taking something, it wasn't from the farm that I spoke with. Until the day he died, Mr. Hughes believed that he had encountered an unknown species of animal. In fact, he told me that after his story came out, many other neighbors in the area told him that they too had seen a similar looking creature. They were just too afraid to talk about it, afraid that people would think they're crazy. But not all stories continue forever. Some seem to be nearly forgotten. That's exactly what happened in Steinthal, Wisconsin. Today, there's not much there. It's a ghost town, maybe literally. But back in the 1960s and 1970s, this was the paranormal hotbed for Wisconsin activity. The reason being is because of this old abandoned house on the outskirts of town. People would drive out to the old farmhouse because they claimed it was haunted. In fact, kids would go out there and claim that lights, mysterious disembodied lights, would float inside the house. Shadowy figures could be seen walking around. Others would hear noises of people talking in the house, but nobody was there. But since so many people ventured out there, it started taking on a Bigfoot story as well, because the house was surrounded by all kinds of marsh and swampland, as you can kind of see in this grainy newspaper photo of the time. That's when people started seeing a 7 to 8 foot tall, Bigfoot looking creature with giant green eyes. And when I say eyes, I mean eyes plural, because many witnesses reported that the thing had 3 eyes and they were all green. The newspapers had no idea what to call this thing, so they called it the Thing. Back in the 1960s and 70s, the Steinthal Tavern was positioned right where this chapel now is today. It's no longer there. But what would happen is people would show up at the Steinthal Tavern and sit outside waiting for the monster to appear. Or at least I think that's why they were there, because everything I can find about the Steinthal Tavern points that it was a really odd place. All the advertisements from the 60s and 70s, they all point to exotic dancers there every weekend. But what would happen is people would stare across the street where my colleague Kevin Nelson is pictured here. He's right in front of the old mill. That's where the creature would often be sighted. But the question then becomes, what happened to the Steinthal monster? Where does an 8 foot tall, green-eyed creature go to hide? Is it still there? Did it leave? Did they kill it? I'll leave it up to you to head to Steinthal and come to your own conclusion. I love this next story because it illustrates that sometimes not only do you get a paranormal story of one phenomena, but you get several as well. This is right outside of Madison in a town called Evansville. It's Weary Road, thought to be haunted by Old Man Weary. When he was alive, it was said that he was nasty old man. He would often abuse children and treat everyone terribly. And even though the legend seems to be completely made up about his character, as you can see by the amount of graffiti on the location, people go out there because the road is thought to be haunted. Many legends tell that you will see shadowy creatures lurking in the trees, weird lights. You will hear people talking to you. But when you look around, nothing but farmland. The bridge also has a dare to it. Oftentimes, these haunted places will have dares attached to them. You have to do something in order for the legend to come true. And the dare at Weary Road is that if you're foolish enough to park your car on the bridge, when you turn it off, it will not start up again. Many claim that that's when the ghost of Old Man Weary will start to chase you off of the road. Almost always he appears to approach from the back end of the vehicle. Some even claim that he smashed out the back of their windshield with a brick before chasing them out of the area. But there might be more than just Old Man Weary out at Weary Road. A few years back, I spoke with a woman who was up there in age. She told me that she had been out to Weary Road many times over the years, but some friends of hers were coming to visit, and she wanted to take them out there to get them into the mood of a scary night, to have some fun. But as soon as she took them out there, she said she felt the feeling that they shouldn't be there. All of them seemed to be creeped out and had a sense that they should leave as fast as they could. But before they hightailed it out of there, they looked over on the bridge and noticed this creature staring right back at them. She said it was the size of a bear, but shaped more like a wolf or a dog. It had glowing yellow eyes and sharp fangs. Even though she was in the presumed safety of her vehicle, she got the distinct feeling that if she wouldn't have left, this creature would have killed her. And that's very common for people who experience these things, almost as though they're in a zone of fear, because an irrational fear overcomes them, where they feel if they don't get out of the area, something bad will happen to them very quickly. But if you'd rather not go looking for Old Man Weary or this weird creature, I recommend you dip your toes into some of Wisconsin's nearly 15,000 lakes. Here I am at one of my expeditions over at Loch Ness looking for the Loch Ness Monster. I'm the one in the blue without the really cool beard. But little did I know, if I wanted to see sea serpents, I should have stayed in Wisconsin. You see, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Wisconsin was overrun with sea serpents. As of today, I've collected over 40 different lakes, rivers, and streams in our state that all claim or did claim to have had a monster in them. In fact, it was said that if you were a resort town during those time periods and you did not have a sea serpent story, you were behind the times, losing out on tourists from Chicago coming up to our lakes. One of my favorite lakes to go in Wisconsin is Devil's Lake State Park, the most visited state park in Wisconsin. It's an odd location where all kinds of weirdness is said to take place. It's known mostly for its effigy mounds. Now, effigy mounds were native burial grounds, sacred, often raised up in the form of an animal that could best be viewed from the sky. There are several still available to see at Devil's Lake State Park. At one time, it's believed that we had nearly 20,000 of these effigy mounds in Wisconsin. Today, we have less than about 4,000 still remain. Even the history of the lake's name comes with some controversy and mystery. Many of the translations translated into Mystery Lake, Spirit Lake, Sacred Lake, and of course, Devil's Lake. The origin of the lake was said to have been created around it by a fight between the giant thunderbirds of the sky and the sea serpents of the waters. The thunderbirds would drop down huge boulders on the sea serpents. The sea serpents would then shoot spouts of water up at the birds. It was said that the sea serpents won and the thunderbirds flew off somewhere else and the sea serpents remained in Devil's Lake. Some of the first peoples there told oral tales of the lake being inhabited by a giant leviathan of the deep. One story tells of a young man going down to the water and noticed that it was riling up like it was boiling. Then, without warning, a giant tentacle came out and pulled him out and drowned him in the water. Anytime anyone drowned or capsized, they blamed it on the sinister monster. When the white pioneers came to the area, they too reported the monster. One of my favorite accounts happened in 1892. As you can see by the newspaper drawings, some men were out fishing one day on the lake when all of a sudden they saw a giant monster rise up out of the water. So big, they had never seen anything like it. It started moving toward them. They were fearful it was going to consume them, but its head was darting back and forth as though it was looking for someone or something. In a matter of a few moments, they realized what it was looking for. They claimed that an identical looking creature, the same size, came up and the two started fighting. The waves were so high from their fight, it almost capsized the boat. And then the creatures tangled among one another and descended into the waters. The witnesses did not see them again. Other weirdness happened at the lake. In 1901, a man was convinced he had seen an alligator moving through Devil's Lake. Keep in mind, though, that alligators are not native to Wisconsin. They'd have a hard time surviving our harsh, cold winters. The stories around Baraboo region of Devil's Lake continued through the 1900s, all the way up to modern times. One of the oldest legends tells that when you go there and go out on the lake, especially on foggy, eerie days, you will see what appears to be the ghostly image of a native man out in an old dugout canoe. And when you try to get close to him or take a photo, he vanishes into thin air. Others claim that the campground at the park is haunted as well, that at night a mysterious ghost travels from campsite to campsite looking for the best campfire to haunt those who have it. It's unknown if it's the same spirit from the water or someone or something entirely different. But my advice is if you go there, make sure your neighbors always have a slightly better campfire than you do, so you will not be cursed by this spirit. I love stories of ghosts and haunted places. And a lot of people, when they think of hauntings, they often think of cemeteries. And if you're looking to go to one of these cemeteries, I recommend you head to Church Road Cemetery, right outside of Portage. Actually, I recommend you don't go to this place. It's in the middle of absolutely nowhere. You have to drive down a dead-end road to get there. And when you do, you'll see tucked off to your left a small little cemetery. But it's not just the cemetery that has haunted stories. The road itself to get there is thought to be haunted as well. One version of the legend tells of a distraught young girl going out to the cemetery one night. She had gone crazy, psychotic, lost her mind. So when she went out there, she brought a rope and tied it around a tree and took her life on the road. Now, many people claim that when they pass by the trees on the side of the road, they too see the ghostly image of a woman hanging on the tree. But don't let that dissuade you from going inside. If you do go inside, all kinds of oddities are said to happen. People hear disembodied voices in the woods talking to them, odd balls of light, weird, mysterious odors floating through the cemetery. One of the first times I was there, I was with my colleague, Terry Fisk. He had just walked to the back of the graveyard when all of a sudden he felt ill, like he was going to vomit or throw up. But as soon as he walked back, he was fine. He went back there and the same thing happened. But yet when I went back there, I was perfectly fine. We didn't know it at the time, but others have reported being overcome with a sense of illness and like they were going to throw up or vomit and getting sick at this cemetery. The best thing about the cemetery is that it's so rural and so secluded that nobody will bother you while you're there. At least not anyone who's alive, that is. If anyone's ever heading over to Stevens Point, you might want to take Highway 66. Except the locals, they don't call it this. They call it Bloody Bride Bridge. The legend is many years ago, while coming home on her wedding night, a bride was involved in a car accident on this bridge. She bled to death waiting for help to arrive. Since that moment, many unsuspecting motorists have been driving down the road when all of a sudden they catch a glimpse of what appears to be a woman in a bloody bridal gown walking across the bridge, vanishing into thin air. One of the first witnesses was said to be a law enforcement officer. As he was driving over the bridge at night, out of nowhere, the spirit, or what appeared to be a woman in a bridal gown, appeared in front of his vehicle. He slammed on the brakes, closed his eyes, and braced for impact. When he came to a screeching halt, he got out to see the damage and the victim, only to find nobody was there. No damage to his car. He had struck nothing. He left convinced he had seen the bloody bride of Highway 66. But the story gets even better with the dare, because the dare tells that if you park your car on this bridge, when you look into your back mirror, not only will you see the ghost of that bloody bride, but many witnesses claimed that she was actually sitting right in their back seat as they look back. Now, luckily or unluckily for me, the dozen or so times I've waited for her, she has not appeared for me, knock on wood, but maybe she will appear for you. But if you're going to do this dare, I recommend you be very careful. This is a very busy bridge these days. I do not want to have to include you in my next program as another ghost haunting Bloody Bride Bridge. One of the first cases I ever investigated for hauntings was nearly 25 years ago, a case I'm still working on today. Right outside of my hometown of Eau Claire is a small place called Elk Lake Dam. And it was here one night, don't worry, there's nothing to see on this slide, when two men were sitting where the lower arrow is. They were just watching the water go by. It's a beautiful place, just enjoying themselves. When all of a sudden one of them turned around, and where the top arrow is, he noticed what appeared to be a glowing woman in white standing behind him. He nudged his buddy with his arm and said, "Hey, do you know there's a glowing woman right behind us?" His buddy said, "Yes, but I'm too afraid to turn around and look." About a half hour went by. They finally got the collective courage to turn around, and thankfully the woman was gone. So were the two men. They hightailed it out of there as fast as they could. One was so frightened he wouldn't even bring us back to show us where the event took place. The other one did. At the time, I was a UW Stout student in their psychology program, and one of the cohorts in my program was a young man named Aaron. He believed he was psychic, intuitive. He could pick up on these spirits. So I brought him along on the investigation. When we went there, we wanted to take a photo of one another where the two men would have been sitting that evening. But you can see in this photo, Aaron's camera would not work. It worked before, it was working properly later, but it would not snap a photo. Luckily, my camera did snap a photo. And when the film came back, this was back when people actually used film, I noticed a weird mist or fog right where the two men saw that woman. It wasn't visible to the naked eye when I snapped the photo, but there it was, something on the photo. So I started talking about this case quite a bit. After one program, a gentleman came up to me and said that he lived out in that area in the 1970s. He recalled there was a murder out there, but that's all he could remember. So I started digging through the newspaper archives. Unfortunately, by the time I reached the year 1974, I realized the man was right. A young woman had been murdered out there. But not just any nameless, faceless young woman. This young woman. Her name was Mary. She was hitchhiking from Minneapolis to Chicago. Last seen being picked up on the side of the road by this gentleman, who was last seen kicking dirt and leaves over something on the side of the road. Neighbors thought it was suspicious, so they called the police in this rural neighborhood. By the time they got there, the man was gone. The body of young Mary was on the ground, stabbed to death. And even though they had a witness description, the man was never captured and the case went unsolved. Well, now I decided to go back after that. If the place was haunted, maybe it was this young woman haunting it. So I brought Aaron the psychic with me again. He wanted me to take a photo of this pillar, which I did. I took dozens that evening. The only one out of the ordinary is again this weird mist or fog. It was also here we heard a scream that evening that sounded part woman, but not quite human, almost as though it was a recording of some sort. But as we were leaving, Aaron believed that the spirit of Mary was going to try to follow us back to campus. We took one last photograph, and I'll let you decide whether she was following us back, because when the film came back, this is what appeared on the film. Many people have seen all kinds of shapes and shadows on here, but the good news is that recently the Dunn County Sheriff's Department reopened the case looking into the murder of this young woman. They even dug up her body looking for DNA evidence, which unfortunately they did not find. Hopefully they can solve it and give this woman's spirit the peace and rest that she deserves. Believe it or not, this is the most common question I receive. Where can I go to spend the night in a haunted place? Well, if you have that macabre sense of adventure, you're in luck, because in Wisconsin, we have all kinds of haunted lodging options, campgrounds, B&Bs, hotels, motels, resorts, and the like. One of my favorite places is in Milwaukee. It's the old Ambassador Hotel. Today, it's a fine, upstanding place to spend the night. Very nice. You'll love it. But back in the 1970s and 80s, it was a cesspool. They rented hotel rooms out to drug dealers, prostitutes, criminals, even the occasional serial killer. This is Jeffrey Dahmer, the cannibal of Milwaukee. Dahmer spent many nights staying at the Ambassador Hotel. One night back in 1987, he went out drinking and picked up this gentleman, brought him back to his room where they drank the night away. The next morning, when Dahmer awoke, this young man was dead. Dahmer claimed he had no recollection as to what had happened. So instead of going to the police and explaining the accident, Dahmer went out and bought the biggest trunk he could find, came back, chopped the man up, and put him in the trunk. Ever since that moment, people believe the Ambassador has been haunted. Often on nights, people will call down to the front desk complaining that those staying in the room next to them are fighting to their death. Oftentimes, they're told no one is staying next to them. Others see the ghostly image of a man covered in blood walking through the hallways here and then vanishing by walking into a wall and disappearing. It's thought that he's Dahmer's victim or one of his victims. We don't know how many other people Dahmer may have killed at the Ambassador. Others claim to see Dahmer's spirit itself walking through the old lobby of this hotel. So again, if that's the way you like to travel, if that's your macabre sense of adventure, you will love staying at the Ambassador Hotel. But it seems like every community has one of those old roads out in the middle of nowhere that has a haunted reputation, that nobody wants to go there. Right outside of New London is one such place. It's called Marsh Road. It received its name because on both sides it's covered in marshland. The story goes back many, many decades. I've tracked it back to at least the 1950s, but the legends probably predate that by some extent of time as well. One of the main legends tells that during October, after homecoming ceremonies, the homecoming king and queen went out to Marsh Road in a suicide pact and took their lives at the end of a rope out on Marsh Road. Now, anyone foolish enough to go out there, especially in October during homecoming, reports seeing the ghostly image of the royalty out there hanging from the trees. They often vanish right into thin air. But there's an even more sinister version out there, because dating back to the same time period, many generations ago, many believe that when they went out there, they've encountered some sort of creature that shouldn't be there, some sort of creature that couldn't be there, but yet there it is staring back at them. So what are these witnesses spotting? Well, maybe I better let you just take a look. This creature, they call it the goat man, sometimes half human, half goat on the upper torso, sometimes a human bottom torso, and a goat upper torso. In fact, some legends tell that it wasn't a suicide pact that did in the homecoming king and queen, that it was actually the goat man that ripped them apart and partially devoured their bodies. And when the police came out there, they blamed it on suicide, not to panic the local people. And whether or not you believe in goat man or phantom royalty ghosts, this is a creepy area. You can't help but to get a little spooked when you walk down the road at midnight and hear the wind rustling through the trees and the crack of the branches. Your mind will conjure up images of the goat man chasing you off of Marsh Road. Right outside of Menominee is one of my favorite islands in Wisconsin, an old place called Mary Dean. At one point, an entire town lived out on the island. They named it after a young girl by the name of Mary Dean, who is said to have drowned while coming up on a steamship many years ago. Her body was said to have been buried in an unmarked grave on the island. Now, many people claim she still haunts the island and the water where she met her tragic end. But the dare here is even better, and it's a lot of fun. So what is the dare? Well, let's take a look. I'm here at the boat landing of Mary Dean, where the dare is that if you're foolish enough to the vengeful spirit of Mary Dean, you'll meet a watery grave and spend eternity in the river with Mary Dean. So I'm going to take this dare right now. No life jacket, no swimming apparel, just me versus Mary Dean. So let's see how this goes. I know you're all wondering if I survived this or not. Bear with me with some microphone issues here. The water will get deep, and then it'll get low, and then it'll get deep again. People that see her spirit claim that she acts like a siren trying to entice them in, saying things like, "Help me, save me, I'm drowning, I can't swim, don't leave me out here." The legend is that if you're foolish enough to go in, she'll pull you under and drag you to your watery grave. Every year I hear from a handful of people that have seen her. Now, you don't need to pay to camp on the island. You don't need to register. You're just welcome to camp there. It's a very fun island to camp on. Just watch out for the ticks. I'm out here in the middle. So I wait out there for quite some time, and then I make my way back to the safety of the shoreline. Well, thankfully, the spirit of Mary Dean did not pull me under into those dark, churning, cold waters of the river. So another dare completed. So if you like dares like that, you can go to my website and see me do dozens of them. You don't need to risk your life. You can watch some crazy person risk their life. Every year, several people drown in this very location. Over the years, I've spoken with many of their friends and family who told me that they were drawn out there for some unknown reason, and it cost them their life. But the story gets even better, because the legend is that when the island was inhabited, there were dogs out on the island, and they mauled some children, so the dogs had to be put to death. And now the legend tells that when you go there, not only will you see the ghost of Mary Dean, but if you park your car at the boat landing and get out, you will see what many are calling the hellhounds of Mary Dean. These are large black dogs with glowing red or green eyes. They've been reported throughout history in nearly every culture on the planet. Many cultures believe these things do the devil's bidding, that they guard portals to hell, and that they act like a death omen, a harbinger of death, that if you see one, it means you or someone you know will die very shortly after seeing them. But hellhounds might not be the scariest thing roaming Wisconsin either. For that, we turn to my good friend and colleague, Linda Godfrey. Thanks to Linda's research, Wisconsin is now known as the werewolf capital of the world. It all began when Linda was working as a journalist. She started receiving reports of people traveling down a small stretch of road called Bray Road. There, they would often see what appeared to be, for a lack of a better term, a werewolf on the side of the road. The good news is that outside of charging at a couple of these vehicles, these creatures seem to be just as afraid of witnesses as witnesses are of it. And rather than attack, they seem more likely to scurry into the underbrush undetected. They're the size of a bear, but shaped more like a wolf with the long muzzle and the deep, dark, matted down fur. But since they don't seem to attack many people, the good news is if you go out to Bray Road looking for them, most likely you won't be killed. Well, 50-50. Pretty good odds. But I want you to keep in mind, as we went through a lot of strange creatures this program, that not all monsters in Wisconsin tend to look like this. In fact, some monsters in our state are even scarier than this, because some monsters roaming Wisconsin, well, those monsters looked a little bit more like this. Now, this is Ed Gein, the butcher of Plainfield, Wisconsin. If you forgot Ed's story back in the 1950s, you may recall some of the movies they based on him, including Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs, and many, many others. Now, most people just recall Ed as a murderer, and true he was. He killed 2 people that we know of, probably half a dozen more, including his own brother. But before he was captured, he was well-liked in Plainfield. Odd, but well-liked. He would often babysit for kids and bring his neighbors over what he called a venison stew for them to eat. One neighbor told me he remembered his mother getting this stew, and it had such a horrible smell, she threw it away, which is good for her, because even though Ed was a murderer, his real passion was to wait until it got dark. Then he would fire up his vehicle, head down to the nearby cemeteries, where he would dig up the remains of women that reminded him of his own deceased mother. He would then bring those remains back to his farmhouse, where he lived in squalor. He would turn them into lampshades and furniture. He had skulls all over his house. When he really got a bug in his system, Ed would make an entire outfit of this material, and he would wear it like a demented Halloween costume as he danced under the moonlight out in his yard. But when we finally caught Geen and discovered how truly evil his crimes were, they wanted to open his house as a museum of horrors. But before they were able to do so, it mysteriously caught fire and burned to the ground. The townsfolk torched it, allegedly. But even though Geen is no longer with us in this life, his farm has been burned down, many believe he has forever cursed the town of Plainfield. And maybe they're right. People have all kinds of experiences at the cemeteries where Geen dug up his victims. People will go out there and see what appears to be a man digging a grave by hand. But when they get closer, he simply is not there. Others hear screams coming from the gravesite of Ed Geen. Well, his gravesite, not his gravestone, because the gravestone is no longer there. People kept stealing it, so they did not replace it. But you can find where he's buried. Others believe the old hardware store where he killed Mrs. Warden is haunted. For decades after, it served as a hardware store. I interviewed numerous former employees that told me oftentimes they would see a woman come into the store, and when they went to help her, she would vanish right into thin air. Others say they'd be working, doing maintenance when items would be thrown by some unseen force. Others claim you could hear the sound of a rifle being shot in the store, even though no rifle was being shot at the time. Geen killed Mrs. Warden with the rifle. For decades, it served as a hardware store. Recently, the hardware store moved. The last time I was there, the place was for sale. Maybe it still is, and you can own a piece of Wisconsin's grisly history if you so choose. But by far the most common and popular place people go is Geen's farm. As you saw, the house is no longer there, but the land is. Many people go there and claim to see the spirit of Geen himself walking on his estate. Others will hear the faint cries of women thought to be his victims. One of the first times I went there, I had two psychics with me. They had no idea where we were, but as soon as we pulled up, they refused to get out of the car because they were picking up on too much negative energy. You would not believe how many people travel to Plainfield just to see Ed Geen and the history of this most gruesome case. But as I'm running low on time this evening, I'm going to end on the most common case I receive. By far, the overwhelming majority of people who contact me about a haunting, it's not about a suicide, an untimely death, an accident, a murder, a mob hit, serial killers. It's about their house being haunted. Some believe it's haunted by a relative. They smell grandma's perfume on the anniversary of her death, or grandpa's cigar on his birthday. Others have no idea who or what may be haunting it. Believe it or not, some are okay with it. It doesn't bother them. Others are looking to do anything they can to get the spirit out of their home. But I bring this up last because it's the case I want you to remember the most. Because tonight, after all of you finish with the program, and later when you put your head down on your pillows and you hear the wind rustling outside your window, I want you to ask yourself, is it possible, just maybe, that wasn't the wind whistling outside, and maybe you too are living in a haunted location? So with that, if you want to save the last 10 minutes or so we have, for any questions, if you want to put them into the chat room, we can get to them after this. If you want more information, my website has more than you could ever want or need. But I hope your adventure does not end here this evening with the program. Grab one of my books. Go on your own adventure of Wisconsin. And when you do, I think you'll discover that we live in one heck of a weird state. And I mean that in a good way. You're going to see things you've never seen. You'll meet some odd people. And along the way, you might just discover that the scariest thing out there is often yourself. So again, I'd like to thank the library for having me here this evening. I can't think of a time in history where the library has served a more important function than it does today. With everything going on with the pandemic, politics, societal issues, the library is that fabric that keeps our communities together, a real treasure for any place lucky enough to have them. So if you like programs like this, let the library know so you get more of these. If you didn't like tonight's program, let them know so you get fewer of these. But either way, they should be applauded for getting me here. And as an appreciation, if you want to go to my website and order any of my books, just type in the coupon code library and you'll get 15% off all of my books just for showing up to this program. So I'm going to check the chat. We'll see if there are any questions from any of you. Good old Eddie. Yeah, I stayed at the Ambassador. Did you ever find anything out about the UFO in Menominee, Elk Mound, back in 1999, 2000? Yes. Many people saw it. One gentleman I talked with said he saw it floating. Well, if this is the same one they're referring to, but it was the same time period. Reported seeing it in his field. And he was watching it with his wife one early morning. They watched it so long that they called the police. When the officer got there, he too watched it. Said he had not seen anything like this ever in his entire career. He had no idea what it was. So he said he was going to get in his car and radio it in and see if anyone knew what this thing was. Well, they kept watching it, the husband and wife, and they never heard back from the gentleman. They called again, and this time the police weren't too happy to come and visit. They didn't show up. The next day, the police officer told the Leader Telegram newspaper that after having time to think about what he saw and consult with his superiors, he now thought he had seen the planet Venus floating around. But I spoke with many people that claimed to have seen it when they were out on break the night before, even that morning. So yeah, the UFO, my program UFO Wisconsin, I dive pretty deep into the Menominee case as well. Thanks for the question. See if there's anything else. Doesn't look like anything else, so I will stop screen sharing this now. Now the library is recording this. They're going to post it on their sites in the future here. So if you have in-laws that you'd like to get even with, you can tell them about the program. So with that, again, I want to thank all of you for coming, and please keep an eye